me the story of Jesus, write on thy heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard. Love in that story so tender, clearer than ever I see. Say, let me read what you whisper, love paid the ransom for me. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
Okay, this morning I want you to turn first to Proverbs chapter 3. I'm going to preach on something I haven't preached on in almost 2 years. It was February 18th was the last time I brought a sermon on this, and I've had 3, 4, or 5 different people ask me to talk about it. So since I do take requests, even though this is one that I've talked to all of the other ministers that we fellowship with. This is the hardest one for any of us to do because there's no way that you can bring this without people thinking that you're begging for money. And I'm not begging for money. So it has nothing to do with that. But we do need to go over it because while God will take care of me as long as I remain faithful to do my job, He may not take care of you if you're not faithful to do yours. Okay? So this is more about you than it is about me. Understand that. These are guidelines that, I was talking to Elder Wagner last night. And about this very thing, and he brought up some interesting points that I'm going to borrow from him as we go through this, and he already said it was okay, so I'll let you know when it is. But he feels, exactly the same way on this. It's not that this is something that we have seen the benefit in people's lives when they follow God's teaching, even though there are people out here like Benny Hinn and all these other false teachers that live on this stuff and preach it every 2 seconds, and I preach it every 2 years, whether I need to or not. But there are sometimes things that are true, even if they come from false teachers. Did you know that the Catholic Church teaches that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin? Well, they do. And they're right. And so we don't throw away the good stuff that they teach. We throw away the bad stuff that they teach. And there are some things that they teach that are absolutely true. Now, don't take that to think that I'm preaching some prosperity thing. I'm not. But I am preaching what God instructs us as His children to do. Okay? Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. Honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. There's a promise in there. The promise is that if you are faithful to support God's work in this world, you will get by in this world better than if you're not. Just that simple. Now, let me ask you a question just to get this point out. I'm reading this out of a King James Bible, okay? I did not write the King James Bible, so I didn't put that verse in there. Other than my son, my wife, and the children in the church, I did not give any of you the copies of your King James Bible, so I never had the opportunity to tamper with it and change the writing in those verses. God wrote these verses at the hand of Solomon. He's the one that made this promise. Okay, so don't shoot the messenger. As I go through these verses, I'm not the one that wrote them. God wrote these at the hand of Solomon. The other thing I want to show you, I'm going to look at some other commentators that down through history comment on this passage, so that you see that this isn't some newfangled thing that Kenneth Copeland came up with. That this goes all the way back. It's nothing new. Okay? Now, what we're talking about here is first fruits. This word first fruits comes from reshith, a Hebrew word that means the first in place, time, order, or rank, specifically a first fruit, beginning, chief, first, the principal things. In other words, God wants the best. He wants the first. He wants people living in faith. He doesn't want leftovers. He doesn't want people waiting at the end of the month and saying, okay, well, I got this much in, and I spent this much, and I got 15 cents left. Here you go, God. That's not first fruits. He wants you to lay it by your side first in faith. Now, Chad shared this with me, so I'm going to give him, Chad Wagner shared this with me, so I'm going to give him the credit for it. If I stood up here and made a promise that the first 10 people that got to the pulpit at the end of the sermon, the first 10 that got up here and gave me a $100 bill, that 6 months from now I would guarantee to give you $500 back. If you believed me, if you had faith that I could pull that off, if you trusted me, how long would it take you to get? Wouldn't you be one of the first to rush up here and do it? That's a pretty good return. You're not going to get that kind of return in the bank. If you believed that I told you the truth on that, you'd be rushing down here to make sure that you were one of the 10 that got in on the offer. Well, look what God says again. Honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. You should certainly trust him more than you trust me. That's what God says. You honor him, and he will take care of you in a way that you can't imagine. Okay? Now, let's see. Here's something that was written many, many years ago. It says, and with the first fruits of all thine increase, or out of the chief of all thine increase, God must have the best, and in the first place. The allusion is either to the maintenance of the priests and Levites under the law, and the manner of doing it, which among other things was out of the annual produce of the earth and the first fruits of it, and may respect the comfortable support of gospel ministers under the present dispensation. I didn't write that. John Gill wrote that in the 1600s. You can go back and take a look at his commentary. He wrote that. Sounds kind of like what the rest of us have been saying, doesn't it? Here's another one for you. Verse 9, honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase, with thy substance or with thy riches. Lay out thy estate, not only to please and advance thyself or family, but also to glorify God, which is done by the payment of all those offerings and dues which God hath required, by giving according to thy abilities whatsoever is necessary for the support and advancement of God's worship and service in the world, by free and liberal contributions to those whom God hath made his deputies, and as I may say, the receivers of his rents, to wit, faithful ministers and good Christians, and all others who need and require thy help. The performance of these duties is here called an honoring of God, partly because that word is sometimes used for giving of gifts, as in 1 Timothy 5:17, and elsewhere, and partly because it is a testimony of our respects to God, of our obedience to him as our sovereign Lord, and that in hard and costly duties of our thankfulness to him as our chief benefactor and donor of all that we have, and of our belief of his promises made to the faithful practicers of this duty, which if they were believed, the most covetous persons would be the most charitable. That's interesting, huh? If people believed God on this, the ones that are the most covetous, the ones that are the most tight-fisted, would be the first to run down the aisle and get the $100 to the preacher so that he could get the $500 back. Okay? And then he goes on with the first fruits. Verse 10, so shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. This is not the way to diminish thy estate, as covetous and profane persons allege, but rather to increase it. shall burst out, shall be so filled that they would burst out if not carefully prevented. That was written by Matthew Poole, another Reformed minister that didn't fall too far from us. Here's another one relative to the promise that the barns will be filled with plenty. Another gentleman said this: a promise which makes it our interest to serve God with our estates. It is the way to make a little much, and more, it is the surest and safest method of thriving. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty. He does not say thy bags, but thy barns. Not thy wardrobe replenished, but thy presses. God shall bless thee with an increase of that which is for use, not for show or ornament, for spending and laying out, not for hoarding and laying up. Those that do good with what they have shall have more to do good with. Note, if we make our worldly estates serviceable to our religion, we shall find our religion very serviceable to the prosperity of our worldly affairs. Godliness has the promise of life that now is, and most of the comfort of it we mistake if we think that giving will undo us and make us poor. No, giving for God's honor will make us rich. And I've got verses that are going to show that as we continue on. That was written by a fellow by the name of Matthew Henry, who's well known and well respected as a theologian from the 1600s. Many of you have his commentaries in your libraries. Here's another one. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. So far from becoming poorer by giving to the Lord's honor out of thy substance. It is thus that thou shalt become abundantly enriched with all manner of meat and drink. So in Hezekiah's time, Azariah the high priest said, since the people began to bring the offerings into the house of the Lord, we have had enough to eat and have left plenty, and the Lord hath blessed his people, and that which is left is this great store. That's from 2 Chronicles 31:10. And that's from the commentary by Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown. So this is no new idea. This has come down for centuries, and it has always been in effect. And the only people I have ever met in my entire life that claim it doesn't work are the ones that don't do it. I've never yet met anyone that was faithful to take care of the first fruits and to give to the ministry and the church the way they should that has ever claimed it doesn't work, I went broke as a result. Never met one of those. But I meet all kinds of people that complain about it, but they don't do it, and they suffer financially as a result of it because they tend to think, well, I can't. Part of this is because we live in a country now where they have made sure to keep people living at 115 or 120% of what they make. The easy credit, the availability of debt, the fact that they have so narrowed things down that in most families both husband and wife have to work in order to make ends meet. That's been an attack on God's kingdom forever. But if people would, I'm getting away from myself, but people will then say, well, I can't afford to do this. You can't afford not to do it, because this is where faith comes in. This is where trust comes in. And I'm telling you that if I could guarantee you an increase, you'd take advantage of it if you believed it. God is guaranteeing you an increase. Do you believe Him? Do you trust Him? Okay? Whether you do or not, that's between you and Him. And believe me, He knows whether you do or not. Now let's look at the fact that, turn to Genesis chapter 4. We want to look at the fact that Scripture does place a great deal of emphasis upon giving. And one of the things that we commonly hear is that when we start talking about the tithing and the 10%, all that's over the Old Testament, and people will say, well, there's no New Testament verse out there that forces us to do this. There's no New Testament text out there that says it's no longer appropriate, though, either. So if you're going to argue that I don't have to pay attention to that because it's in the Old Testament, my argument is show me where he did away with it. Show me the verse where God says you don't have to apply this any longer. He put it in the Old Testament time and time and time again. Do we throw out other things that are in the Old Testament just because we don't have a clear-cut verse in the New Testament that says you have to follow that? Of course not. Of course not. He wrote the whole book. So when you have a verse that clearly says you don't have to pay attention to this anymore, then show it to me. But until then, I think the burden of proof is on you, not on the Bible. Okay? Now, the first act of worship that is ever recorded in Scripture consists of bringing an offering to God. Genesis chapter 4, verse 3. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord, and Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and the fat thereof, and the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. That's the first act of worship that we find in the Bible, an offering that was made. Now, there's a sermon in that verse, and I don't want to get so far afield that rabbit pops up over there as a warning, but understand that this is the first act of worship, was bringing an offering to God. The word offering is a noun. It means that which is presented in divine service, an animal or a portion of bread or corn or of gold and silver or other valuable articles, presented to God as an atonement for sin, or as a return of thanks for his favors, or for other religious purpose, a sacrifice, an oblation. It comes from a Hebrew word that means a gift, as in, we're not going to turn here, but it's recorded in Genesis 32:14, Genesis 32:19, 21, Genesis 43:11, 15, 25, 26, and a whole bunch of other places where it's listed, that word is used as a gift. It means it's a tribute which was exacted from a tributary people under a milder name of a gift. It's offered to a divinity, a sacrifice, specifically a sacrifice without blood, as opposed to a bloody sacrifice. Okay, that's what that word is translated from. So we have this very first act of worship being an offering unto God. Let's think about something for a minute. And I'm going to prove it as we go through this. Everything that you have, you got from God. God says, in order to promote my kingdom in this world, you're going to have to pay a tax, if you will. And I expect out of what I've given you to give some of it back to support my work here in this world. That's what we're talking about. Christian giving. Giving to maintain the church, giving to maintain the ministry. That's the act that we're talking about. I want you to also notice that in Genesis chapter 8, the very first thing that Noah did when he came off the ark, you remember he'd been on the ark for close to a year floating around, and his very first act is found in Genesis chapter 8, verse 18. It says, and Noah went forth, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him, every beast, every creeping thing, every fowl, and whatsoever creepeth upon the earth after their kinds went forth out of the ark. And here's the first thing he did. And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Now, folks, we don't do that anymore. We don't burn sheep anymore. We don't give bloody sacrifices anymore. Those sacrifices were finished in Christ. But as far as making offerings to God, that's still in effect. That's still in effect. If you turn over to Genesis chapter 14. Genesis chapter 14 and verse 20. We're going to read about Abraham, where it says, and bless the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. He's talking about, well, this is when Melchizedek, the priest of the Most High God, comes to Abraham at the end of a war. And Abraham, and by the way, Melchizedek came to him with bread and wine. That's interesting, huh? A little later today, we're going to take part in bread and wine. And so what does Abraham do? We're reading it here. He blessed the Most High God, which had delivered thine enemies into thy hand, and gave him tithes of all. A tithe is an Old English word which means a tenth. That's where that comes from. You'll hear Elder Gerald used to refer to this as 10% money. You talk to the people in Las Vegas, they always use the term 10% money because that's what Elder Gerald always called it. And that's what we got used to it. It's a tithe. It's 10%. That's where that number comes from. It says Abraham gave him tithes. This is from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. It says the custom of giving a tenth part of the products of the land and of the spoils of war to priests and kings. It was a very ancient custom among most nations. That the Jews had this custom long before the institution of the Mosaic Law is shown by this passage as well as Genesis 28:22, which is going to be the very next verse we look at. Now, so think about this for a minute. This is prior to the law. Therefore, giving tithes was prior to the law. So you can't say, well, that's law, I don't have to do it anymore. Right? It's prior to the law. 400 and some years prior to the law that Abraham was doing this. Many critics hold that these two passages are late and only reflect the latter practice of the nation, but the payment of tithes is so ancient and deeply rooted in the history of the human race that it seems much simpler and more natural to believe that among the Jews the practice was in existence long before the times of Moses. That's from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. Again, I didn't write those words. This has been practiced for centuries, for millenniums. It's been in practice, and it's also. I looked at some of the writings of financial folks this week. Some of you might remember Larry Burkett. Now Dave Ramsey has kind of taken his position amongst Christians when it comes to how you go about dealing with your finances and how you should arrange things. You go back and take a look at their works, and you're going to find in every case that when they set up a budget, they set up the gross income and the very first thing that comes off the top of that. In every one of those cases is 10% to go to the church or to charity. In every case. My father had a position. Now he lived off of 50% of what he made. That's how he always lived. He came up through the Depression. He had a good job. He made good money. He didn't make rich kind of money, but he made a decent wage. And he and my mother lived off 50% of what they made. Now, there were times when they seemed to live like paupers. My sister and I thought we were poor. We really did. Coming up, we thought we were just dirt poor. But it wasn't that we were dirt poor. They just had come through the Depression, and so they always took the first 10% and gave it to the church. They always took the second 10% and put it into long-term savings. They always took the third 10% and laid that by their sides in case friends got in trouble or they needed to help somebody else. And they always took that other 20% and invested it in wise investments. And when my father passed away in 1993, he actually retired the year that Wendy and I were married. We were married in 1987. He retired that year. My mother retired shortly after that. Before Blake was ever born, my mom retired, and she was in her 50s at the time she retired. And my father, during his working career, had accumulated enough that he had a $400 and something thousand house paid for. All of his cars were paid for. He was completely out of debt. And he had accumulated enough wealth that my mother, she lived until she was almost 80 years old, never had to worry for anything, never had to lift a finger by going and getting a job, never had to worry for finances. All because my dad lived off 50% of what he made and was faithful to his church his entire life. Now, you look at most people now, they live on more than that. So what do? How do you get out of it? Well, that's probably a different sermon. But the number one thing that you don't do is you do not ignore God. You remain faithful to that and trust that God will fulfill his promise that we read in Proverbs chapter 4. Or, is that right? Yes, Proverbs chapter 3. Honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase, so shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. You honor God with this, God will take care of it. You'd be amazed what he can do. Look at Genesis chapter 28 and verse 22. This is also before the law. Genesis 28, verse 22. Jacob had spent a very rough night, and he discovered that he was at the house of God. And in the morning, he set a stone there, anointed it with oil. And in verse 22, he says, "And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth unto thee." Now that's long before the law. And these are the examples that we have of men that are written about, of great men of faith, right? Abraham and Jacob. Jacob's name was finally changed to Israel, and it was them making these statements. And if you study and look at how God increased their wealth from nothing to greatness, you will see that there's a correlation here. Now, I'm not saying that everybody that follows this is going to get rich, and that should not be the reasoning behind doing it anyway. But for goodness gracious, if somebody gives you the key to being able to get through life without struggling all the time, you would seem to think that most people would take advantage of that. And these are the words of God, not the words of me. He's telling you how to do it. All you have to do is do it. It's that simple. Now, we're not going to turn and look at all these, but if you go through and read the book of Leviticus, there are numerous, abundant instructions in that book regarding how you go about giving to God. Turn to Isaiah chapter 43, because this is not just something that God takes lightly. He does not take this lightly at all. And it's something that it's just a matter of you proving your faith to him. That's really what it boils down to. The only reason that somebody wouldn't do this is because they do not believe that God's able to take care of them. That's the only reason that they wouldn't do it. And those that have done it for years will attest to the fact that they won't quit doing it because of the bounty that they've received as a result of it. It's foolishness not to give back to God. It's just absolute foolishness. In Isaiah chapter 43 and verse 22, we read, "But thou hast not called upon me, O Jacob, but thou hast been weary of me, O Israel. Thou hast not brought me the small cattle of thy burnt offering, neither hast thou honored me with thy sacrifices." You see, this is a matter of honor to God. You hang on to it and don't bring it to him, and you are dishonoring God. Consider that. It's not just a benign thing that, well, we can or we can't and it's no big deal. It's a big deal to God. And that's why I'm preaching this to you. It has nothing to do with me, but it has everything to do with God. "I have not caused thee to serve with an offering, nor wearied thee with increase. Thou hast brought me no sweet cane with money, neither hast thou filled me with the fat of thy sacrifices, but thou hast made me to serve with thy sins. Thou hast wearied me with thine iniquities." You see, it's not a benign thing. I want you to turn to Nehemiah chapter 13. Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 10. Where we read, "And I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given them." Now you remember that under the law, the tribe of Levi were called to be the priests of God. It was their duty to take care of the tabernacle at the time the tabernacle was in effect. It was their duty to take care of the temple at the time the temple was in effect. They were not given any land to own like the other tribes were. The other tribes would then give them some so they have a place to live and such. But if you search through how the land was divided in the nation of Israel, you will not find any portion given to the Levites. But the Levites were given the offerings and the tithes from the people. That's how they maintained themselves. That's how God directed it that they should live. That the people would then bring the tithes to them, and then they would be able to live off of that so that they could do the work that God had given them to do. Okay? It says, "I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given them." Why? "For the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled every one to his field." Instead of paying attention to taking care of God's work, they were out plowing ground so that they could have something to eat because the people weren't taking care of them. Okay? "Then contended I with the rulers and said, Why is the house of God forsaken?" That's the point I'm trying to get to. You decide not to support the church and the ministry, and you are forsaking the house of God. And those are the words of God. Now there's a passage over in Hebrews, I'm not going to link it up here, but there's a passage that talks about not forsaking the assembly, and the assembly is the house of God. That has more to do with things other than just simply not showing up to church on time. "And I gathered them together and set them in their place, then brought all Judah the tithe of the corn and the new wine and the oil into their treasuries." So he told them what they were doing wrong, and in that case, they fixed it. Now, I want you to turn to Haggai chapter 1. This is the opposite of what we read in Proverbs. In Proverbs, while you're turning there, let me read Proverbs again. While you're turning to Haggai 1, it might take you a minute to find it. In Proverbs it says, "Honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase, so shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine." Right? There's a promise. You honor him and you will have plenty. Now let's look at the opposite of this. Haggai chapter 1, verse 2. "Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, The time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. Then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie waste?" God's asking these people, does that seem right to you? That your affairs should be in order, your personal affairs should be in order, and you're not taking any care to take care of the church of God? That's him asking the question. "Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie waste? Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Ye have sown much, and bring in little." Watch this. They're out there working their tails off and not making any money, to put this into modern terms. They're busting their hump and not bringing in any money. You eat, but you have not enough. You see, they're getting by, but they're not getting by well. You drink, but you're not filled with drink. You clothe you, but there's none warm. You're getting by. "And he that earneth wages to put it in a bag with holes." Now think about that. You go out and you work and you work and you work, and you finally get your paycheck, and it comes in the form of silver dollars, and you stick it in a bag, and the bag's got holes in it, falls right through the bottom of the bag, and you got nothing left over at the end of the week. And have you ever lived like that? expenses just keep popping up. Every time you turn around, there's something else. You think, well, we're gonna make it now. We're living on this budget. We'll do fine now. But you don't take care of God, and what happens? You're just sticking your money in a bag of holes, and it falls right out the bottom. And at the end of the year, you're no better off than you were the year before. You spend an entire year working, and you're no better off. You're no farther ahead than you were the year before. You've just barely got by. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, verse 7, consider your ways. Go up to the mountain and bring wood and build the house, and I will take pleasure in it, and I will be glorified, saith the Lord. You looked for much, and lo, it came to little. And when you brought it home, I did blow upon it. Why is this? Because they weren't taking care of the house of God. So all their plans, the big deal that they thought was finally going to make them wealthy, here it is, it finally closes, and they bring it home, and God blows on it, and away it goes, and they got nothing left. Why? Because they weren't taking care of the house of God. That's why. Why saith the Lord of hosts, because of mine house that is waste, and ye run every man unto his own house, therefore the heaven over you is stayed from dew, and the earth is stayed from her fruit. And I called for a drought upon the land, and upon the mountains, and upon the corn, and upon the new wine, and upon the oil, and upon that which the ground bringeth forth, and upon men, and upon cattle, and upon all the labor of the hands. You see, God's able to control these types of things. Do you not believe that He can do it? Do you not believe that He can come up with enough to pay your rent? He created the universe in 6 days and rested on the 7th. You don't have enough faith to think He can take care of your petty little problems? That's what He's saying to these people. You don't trust Him enough to think that He can take care of you? Has He not done so? Can He not do so better if you're faithful to Him? Look at Malachi chapter 1. Malachi chapter 1 and verse 6. The son honoreth his father, and a servant his master. If I then be a father, where is mine honor? And if I be a master, where is my fear? Saith the Lord of hosts unto you, O priests that despise my name. And ye say, wherein have we despised thy name? Flip the page here. Ye honor polluted bread upon mine altar. And you say, wherein have we polluted thee? And that you say, the table of the Lord is contemptible, and if ye offer the blind for sacrifice, is it not evil? Remember the instructions to the children of Israel when they made their sacrifices, when they brought their offerings. You were supposed to bring the best of the flock. It was the best of the flock that you were to bring. It was a lamb without blemish. You weren't supposed to bring the scraggly old sheep that you couldn't sell for anything because it was junk. You were supposed to bring the best. But notice what they're doing. If you offer the blind, you bring in a sheep that's blind. Because I can't do anything else with it, I may as well give that to God. I'm not bringing Him the best, but I'm giving Him something. I'm playing the role. I'm playing like I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, but I know in my heart I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do. You offer the blind for sacrifice. Is it not evil? You see, God considers that evil. And if you offer the lame and sick, is it not evil? Offer it now unto thy governor. Will he be pleased with thee or accept thy person? You think a human would accept that kind of nonsense? Of course not. But you expect God to. And now I pray you, beseech God that He will be gracious unto us. This hath been by your means. Will He regard your person, saith the Lord of hosts? Who is there even among you that would shut the doors for naught? neither do ye kindle fire on mine altar for naught. I have no pleasure in you, saith the Lord of hosts, neither will I accept an offering at your hand. For from the rising of the sun, even unto the going down of the same, my name shall be great among the Gentiles. And in every place incense shall be offered unto my name, and a pure offering, for my name shall be great amongst the heathen, saith the Lord of hosts. But you've profaned it. Think about that. His own children had profaned it, where those that weren't considered his children would be honored with it. You've profaned it in that you say the table of the Lord is polluted, and the fruit thereof, even his meat, is contemptible. You said also, behold, what a weariness is it, and you have snuffed at it, saith the Lord of hosts, and you brought that which was torn, and the lame, and the sick. Thus you brought an offering. Should I accept this of your hand? Saith the Lord. But cursed be the deceiver which hath in his flock a male, and voweth in sacrifice unto the Lord a corrupt thing. For I am a great king, saith the Lord of hosts, and my name is dreadful among the heathen. Here these people were taking the worst that they had and thinking that God couldn't figure out the difference. Thinking that he couldn't read their hearts. Thinking that he wouldn't be able to tell. Well, look, I showed up. I was there on time. I brought something. I gave you an offering, even though it only had one leg and blind and lame and wasn't even hard, and was probably would have just died in the field if I left it out there, so no value to me anyway, so I'll just go ahead and give you that. And God doesn't accept that. Look at Malachi chapter 3, verses 7 through 9. Even from the days of your fathers ye are gone away from mine ordinances, and have not kept them. Return unto me, and I will return unto you, saith the Lord of hosts. But you say, wherein shall we return? Will a man rob God? Yet you've robbed me. But you say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. Now remember, we read in Proverbs that you honor the Lord with your substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase, and your barns will be filled with plenty, right? What happens if you don't? We're looking at what happens if you don't in these passages. These same things apply today. You decide that God can't take care of you, and so you hang on to every penny as tight as you possibly can, and that penny is going to disappear. Or inflation is just going to eat it up. Look at verses 10 through 11. Because this is, I don't have the ability to do this. I made the statement earlier that if the first 10 that came up here with a $100 bill, that in 6 months I'd give you 500. Okay? I could say the same thing that God's going to say here, but I don't have the ability to make sure that it would happen. Some of you might figure, well, you know what? I trust the guy. If I give him 100, he'll give me the 500. He said he would. His word's valid. But I'm not God. I don't have the ability to say the things that God says regarding this, but he does. Now look at this verse. Even from the days of your father, well, wait a minute, wrong one. Malachi 3:10. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing that there shall not be room enough to receive it. Test him. You sit back there and say, well, I don't think it'll work, I don't think it'll work, I don't think it'll work. I'll try it. Try it. Do it for a couple of months and find out if it works. Elder Wagner told me of a couple of people, a couple of members of his church that really truly believed this won't work. But they got tired of suffering. And they thought, well, what difference does it make? We'll go ahead, we'll give it a shot. And within a couple of months, they all got promotions, they got raises, they made more money, they did fine. And so today they swear by it. We have non-resident members out west that have already gone through all of this stuff and learned their lesson. And we'll talk a little bit more about them later on, but not specifics, but we'll talk about, we'll talk about that situation. They've been taught this stuff for generations, for years. They know it, they do it, they follow it. And it's one of the reasons I would like for some of you to go out there and see how they live. Take a look at those folks out there. I think you'd be shocked. I really think you would. I think you would be surprised at how well they seem to be doing. They don't struggle with a lot of the same problems because they've already learned this lesson. So prove Him. You don't trust God? Prove Him. Put Him to the test. I can state from my own personal experience that there were times when I would forget. There were, not lately, but there were times when I would forget and Wendy and I would struggle. And then there were times when I'd be faithful and we wouldn't struggle so much. And now, today, since we moved down here and I came down as a minister, I follow what the other ministers do. When I go home later today, I'll take that box and I'll count what's in it, and 10% of that's going to go in an envelope. And that's God's money. Now, it gets used to buy airline tickets, or it gets used for Bibles for children in the church, or it gets used for, if we need something for the church, it gets used only for things that deal with God's church, period, end of report. That's what it's there for. And if we ever put a church box out there, then my 10% money will go in that box too. I'm not exempt from this. None of the pastors are exempt from this. We all do this, and every one of us follows the rule of 10%. Why would we do it? I'm not asking you to do anything other than what I'm doing. And if you feel, well, you don't, well, I'm not going to, I'll do the 10%, but I'm not putting all of it in the box, that's fine. But you better lay it by your side and not spend it on M&Ms for the kids. Because that's God's money. And there will come a time when that money is needed. Okay? So we see, let's continue on with our verse here. He says, well, I'll start all over. Bring ye the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, saith the Lord of hosts. And all nations shall call you blessed, for ye shall be a delightsome land, saith the Lord of hosts. There's a blessing in this if you simply do what God asks you to do. It's so simple, and yet it's so hard. And the reason it's hard for so many is because they just simply don't have enough faith to trust that God will do it. So this verse says, prove me, test me, put me to the test. Let's see if it'll work. Give it a shot. Find out. Turn to Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28. While you're turning there, I'm going to give you some verses. If you want to write these down, that's fine. If you don't want to write them down, I'm going to move pretty quick. If you don't want to write them down now, they'll be on the tape later. We're not going to turn to all of them. This is simply an answer to the question of, well, the New Testament doesn't talk about this stuff. I'm going to give you 35 passages in the New Testament where it talks about giving. 35 passages. We're not going to look at all of them, or we'd be here for the next 6 months. But 35 passages. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 2, Matthew 2:11, Matthew 6, 1 through 4, Matthew 23:23, Mark 10:21, Mark 12, 41 through 44, Luke 6:38, Luke 11:41, Luke 12:33, John 12:3 through 8, Acts 4:32 through 5:4, Acts 6:1 through 4, Acts 11:27 through 30, Acts 20:35, Acts 24:17, Romans 12:13, Romans 15:25 through 27, 1 Corinthians 9:1 through 18, 1 Corinthians 16:1 through 3, 2 Corinthians 8, chapters 8 and 9, Galatians 6:6, Ephesians 4:28, Philippians 4:14 through 19, 1 Thessalonians 2:6, 2 Thessalonians 3:8 through 9, 1 Timothy 5:1 through 18, 1 Timothy 6:17 through 18, 2 Timothy 1:16 through 18, Philemon 1:13, Hebrews 6:10, Hebrews 13:16, James 2:15 through 16, 1 Peter 4:10, 1 John 3:17 through 18, and 3 John 1:5 through 7. 35 passages that talk about giving in the New Testament. Now, I will grant you that not one of them says, quote, you're required to give 10%. I'll grant you that. But there's no passage anywhere in the Bible that says you're not. And everyone that I know has just followed this rule, and when they follow this rule, things work out like God tells us they will in Proverbs, and when they don't follow this rule, they scratch and beg and barely get by. So, based on empirical evidence, I think the 10% thing applies. Now again, if you're doing the 10% and you put part of it over here and hang on to the other part until the time comes that we need it, then that's what you do. But you know, Chad Wagner said this, and I'll even say the same thing. If you think I'm some sort of a shyster and that I'm up here trying to rip you off, and you think that that's all it's about, then do this. Take the 10% and send it to Chad Wagner. He's a pastor. He's got a little bitty church up in Minnesota. If you don't think you don't want to give it to me because you don't think that I deserve it, then give it to him. But give it to somebody. Give it to a minister. Do what God tells you to do. Now, I don't know why you'd be in a church if you thought the guy was a shyster, but the point being, give it to somebody. Do what God says, and God will reward you. Okay? Now, in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28, we read this: "Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth." One of the main things that we should consider when we're looking for a job or employment is, am I going to have enough from this to be able to give to others? That should be a main consideration when we're looking at at our occupation or a line of work. We shouldn't look at this from a standpoint of, am I going to make enough just to barely get by on my own? No, we should be looking at it from the standpoint of, am I going to make enough so that I can help other people? So that I can have charity, so that I can give to others. Is there sufficient there in order to do that? And if there isn't, if I've reached the top, then I need to change my expenses so that there's money to give, so that I can be gracious to others. That's the part of being a Christian, not trying to hoard it all to yourselves. Turn to Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 2, because I want you to see something. Your salvation is based on a gift, based on an offering by someone else that gave something to you that you don't deserve. Gave something to you that you don't have to, that he didn't have to do. Jesus Christ didn't have to come down here and take on a flesh body and go through all that and hang on it. He didn't have to do that. He didn't do that for himself. He did it for us. It was a gift. And Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 2 says, "And walk in love as Christ also hath loved us, and hath given himself for us an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor." You see, that was an offering. God gave that offering to you and now asks that you make an offering back to him. When I said that everything you have, God gave you, let's not forget your eternal salvation God gave you. Let's not forget your being in this room and having a church to fellowship with. God gave you that too. God gave you the house you live in, the car that you drive, the gas you put in it. It's all a gift from God. He's the one that gave you the intelligence that you have so that you can get a job and make the money that you make. He's the one that gave you the family that you have, that brought you up and so that you would care. He's the one that gave you the friends that you have that will support you at the times that you need help. He gave you everything, and he asks for part of it back to keep his kingdom alive in this world. Turn to Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 15. You see, giving of our substance is a sacrifice to God that honors him. And he's pleased by these sacrifices. It makes him happy when we do what he asks us to do. It pleases him. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 15. "By him, therefore, let us offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually. That is, the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name." You see, he's well pleased when we do that. When we get down on our knees and pray to him and thank him, that pleases him. That's a sacrifice. It took time for us to get down on. It takes some of us more time to get down on our knees than others. And getting down there's not so hard, but for some of us it's hard to get back up again. But that's a sacrifice that he's well pleased by. Verse 16, "But to do good and to communicate, forget not." The word communicate is to impart something to another so that it becomes common to giver and receiver. It refers to the habit of sharing with others either sympathy or property. It's not just sitting around talking. When the Bible is referring to communicating, it's talking about sharing things with others. "Do good and communicate, forget not, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased." Look at Philippians chapter 4 and verse 18. Philippians 4 and verse 18. "But I have all and abound, and am full, having received of Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you, an odor of a sweet smell, a sacrifice acceptable, well-pleasing to God." And then, of course, we have the text that our home text of Proverbs 3, 9 through 10. "Honor the Lord with thy substance, and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine." I've got one other little, well, I've got a couple of little areas I'll cover quickly, and then we'll get ready for communion. The first of this is that Christians are to give for the support of the ministry and to the poor saints. Those are the two things that we're to concentrate on. Now, I have when we finish this, probably next week, then I've got another series where we deal with charitable giving, which goes more into line with the poor saints, with the people that struggle. Because all of us from time to time need help. And that's something that falls back on church members to help. But there are guidelines as to how that's done, and I want to go over that with you so everybody understands how you go about taking care of that. There's a responsibility for us to take care of those that are struggling, but there are also rules involved in that, and I don't want people stepping in a hole and doing something that's going to get themselves in trouble. I'm all for doing it, but I want it done properly. All things are to be done in order. But we're to give for the support of the ministry and for the poor saints. Turn to Galatians chapter 6 and verse 6. And here's, we have that word communicate again. I just defined what communicate means. Galatians 6 and verse 6 says, "Let him that is taught in the word," that's you, "communicate unto him that teacheth," that's the pastor, "in all good things." Now that comes from the Apostle Paul. That's a commandment from Paul, that those that are taught communicate with them that do the teaching. Look next at Galatians chapter 2 and verse 10. And this will describe those that are poor, our duty to the poor. "Only they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I also was forward to do." So you see, we're to support the ministry and we're to help take care of those that are poor. In Romans chapter 15, verses 26 through 27. Romans 15:26. "For it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution," watch this, "for the poor saints, which are at Jerusalem. It hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them in carnal things." You see, they were taking a collection for the poor saints in Jerusalem in that passage. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 1. And here this refers to that same thing. "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye." So there are instructions as to how we deal with giving to poor saints, and that will come in another lesson. This is dealing primarily with the church itself and the ministry. For dealing with others in charitable type of giving, that will come after we finish this part. Okay? Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 15, because there's a couple of things that we need to understand about this, and then we'll hit one more point and then give up and then quit for the day. Deuteronomy chapter 15 and verse 7. "If there be among you a poor man of one of thy brethren within any of thy gates in thy land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not harden thine heart, nor shut thine hand from the poor brother. But thou shalt open thine hand wide unto him, and shalt surely lend him sufficient for his need in that which he wanteth." Do you see why it's important that we don't set our budget to the point that it takes every nickel we make in order to survive? How are we going to help others if we set our budget to the point that it takes every nickel we make to survive? You can't. We should be, and if we're at a point to where it takes every nickel we have to survive, then, and we can't bring any more in, then we need to cut on the expense side of the equation. We need to start cutting out some of those expenses. But one thing we don't do is cut back on the expense of taking care of God's church. Because if we do that, then you can guarantee you're always going to be in the position of just barely making enough to get by. Now, if somebody wants to live like that, that's your business. You know, if you want to thumb your nose at God and say, "I don't trust you and I don't think you can do it," okay, that's between you and him. I've warned you. I've done my job. I'm telling you in advance that that's kind of a stupid position to take. But if that's where you want to be, that's between you and God. You can do that. But I want you to notice here that giving to the poor is regulated according to need. We give according to need. And there's a proviso here. Giving to the poor is not designated to exempt them for working if they're able to work. Now what I mean by that, I already gave you an example of my mother. My mother was one who retired when she was considerably younger than I am now, and was financially well enough off that she didn't have to lift another finger. With my dad's retirement, with the money they had in the bank, with Social Security, she was fine. She didn't have to, so I'm not saying you have to work. If you reach the point at which you can retire, retire. By all means, relax. I'm not out here cracking a whip and saying you have to work. But what I am saying is that if you can't make things work any other way, then God commands you to work if you're able to work. That's a commandment of His. We've got two passages to look at. The first one is found in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10. So for those that reach that point where they're at a point to where they can live off of what they've got without ever walking out the door, then I wish I was in your shoes, because I'm not there. But there are people that get there. And if you're there, God bless you. But if not, then if you're able to work, God says you should work. Okay, 2 Thessalonians 3:10, for even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. It's Paul's commandment that those that are able to work, work. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8 says, but if any provide not for his own, and specially for those of his own house, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. An infidel is an unbeliever. So when it comes to the poor, if they can help out by working, they should help out by working, but we still have a responsibility to help them if need be. Okay? On the other hand, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We're going to begin at verse 6. Giving to a minister is designed to exempt him from having to work another job for income. That's the whole idea. Whatever kind of work I have to do as in secular employment takes away from what I can do as a minister. It's just that simple. Now, all of the ministers that we fellowship with have been blessed to have congregations that provide for them enough so that they don't have to work. We don't have any of them now that have to work. Chad doesn't work anymore. I don't, at least in the secular field. Okay, we've been blessed to be able to do that. But that's how it should be. That's how it should be. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6. Or I only and Barnabas, have we not power to forbear working? What do you think? Do you think the Apostle Paul and Barnabas probably could have laid off working and just been ministers? You would think, an apostle? Maybe? Who goeth to warfare at any time at his own charges? How many of us ask our military to buy their own bullets to send them out to fight a war for us? Nobody does that. Who planteth a vineyard and eateth not of the fruit thereof? If any of you do any gardening, do you get to eat some of the fruit? If you were a farmer for a living, my parents were farmers for a living, you know what? They ate of the same food that they sold to other people. Who wouldn't? Or who feedeth a flock and eateth not of the milk of the flock? Say I these things as a man, or saith not the law the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. You see, when they would be tearing they'd let the ox eat as he's moving through there. They wouldn't muzzle him. He'd be able to eat off the labor that he did. Doth God take care for oxen? Or saith he it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and he that thresheth in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do ye not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple? Remember the priests in the Old Testament days? You know where their food came from? The sacrifices that the people brought. The people would bring the sacrifices, and that's what they would live off of. You remember that passage we were talking about? The Levites had to go out into the field to go grow their own food because the people weren't providing for them. And that didn't make God very happy. Those that minister about holy things live of the things of the temple. And they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar. Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Gospel ministers should be taken care of so that they don't have to work a secular job. As a result, gospel ministers try to get themselves into a situation where they can live off of what the church has generously provided for them. So we don't live in big fancy houses on Lake Hollingsworth. Okay? Much to Wendy's chagrin. But that's the way it is, because otherwise something's going to get left. If a minister has to go out into the world and work a job for 40 hours a week in order to put food on the table, and many, many, many of them do. Luckily, our congregations, we haven't had to do that. People in our churches have been generous enough so that we don't have to do that. And I'm very thankful for that. Don't get me wrong. But there are a lot of guys out there that have to work 40 hours a week and then try to put something together on Sunday. That's a tough thing. And counsel, and show up at hospitals, and all the rest of it. Luckily, we haven't had that type of a situation here where I'm running all over the town. But you know what? I have a very good friend who's a pastor of a little bit larger church, and he's in the hospital all the time because of people that are in the hospital that he has to visit, or friends of people that are in the hospital that he has to, you know, there are other things that we do other than just sitting at a desk reading a Bible. There's other things involved in the job. So if a minister has to then go out and work a secular job, he doesn't have any time left for the rest of that stuff. And that may not matter to a congregation of young people that are healthy and strapping and don't have any problems, but what happens when you get older? There comes a time when people need a minister for those types of reasons, and you want to make sure that he's there. Okay. Okay. One last point, and then we'll close and take communion. The first place I want you to turn is Philippians chapter 4 and verse 10. Because this giving is to be done as we have the opportunity to give. But if we don't have the opportunity, then we should be ready to give when we do have the opportunity. Okay? In other words, if you're working in the field somewhere and you don't get to church for a couple of weeks, obviously you don't have the opportunity to give because the box is over here. There's been numerous times that people have contacted me and said, I forgot to put my money in the box. You all know who you are. Because sometimes we grab it and go out the door before you got a chance to get over there or whatever. And I will usually say, just bring it next week. And if you're not going to be there next week, then you can go ahead and give it to me. But, You know, it's if you have the if you don't have the opportunity, if I come in here one day and don't bring the box with me because I've forgotten left it at home, well, then you don't have the opportunity. Be ready when the box shows up. We have in Las Vegas, they've got a little coffee can thing. I think it's a Folgers can that they every week they get together and they put their money in. Then once a month, there's one of the members that takes all that, converts it into a money order, and sends it to me in the mail. That's how they go about getting their gifts to me. We have some non-resident members that don't get to church very often, that live away from the Las Vegas or the Phoenix area, so they just usually will send me an envelope with their gift in it, and that's how they deal with it. We have the group in Phoenix, they get together, and I believe they combine it all, and then when they come to Las Vegas, they put it in the Folgers can. And that's when they have the opportunity. See, when you have the opportunity, be ready so that you don't have to, we're going to church this week, we didn't put any money back. That's the point. Keep it, be ready to give, and when you have the opportunity, then give. Philippians 4:10. But I rejoiced greatly in the Lord greatly, that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein ye were also careful. But ye lacked opportunity. You see, sometimes you put it by your side and you keep it and you understand that that's God's money. And one of these days, Wendy and I used to have to do this when we were members in Las Vegas. We had an envelope. We would put the money in the envelope and it would just pile up until it was time to go to Vegas again. Now there were some times that we would take it, if it started to get too big, we would take it and send it to another member of the church and ask them to put it in the box for us. Okay? That way nobody knew where it came from. But there were other times when we would then, when we went to Las Vegas, we'd grab it and take it up there and stick it in the box. That's when we had the opportunity to do it. If you don't have the opportunity, then just be careful so that when the opportunity is there, you're able. It's very simple. Look at Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. Where Paul says, as we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are the household of faith. And finally, 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 18. 1 Timothy 6:18, Paul says that he's reminding people of what they should do, and he says that they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate. Now with that, I'm going to go ahead and hold off on the rest of this until next week. And then we'll pick this back up and continue on. And we've got another Sunday's worth of material to go through on this. So for today, let's just keep in mind these things, that this is not something that God takes lightly. And I'm not beating on your heads because of me. Like I said, there's other ministers out there. Be faithful to God and God will take care of you. And if you don't trust Him, then take a chance on Him. If you don't have enough faith to do it on your own, then prove Him like He said you should do. Test Him. Find out. Check Him out. See if it'll work or not. Give Him a shot. Others have done it. So this message is, don't think that this message is designed to beat on your heads. It's not. This message is designed to try to teach you how to get through this crappy world that we have to live in a little bit easier by following the rules that God has laid down for you. And if you follow those rules, you'll get through it a little bit easier than if you buck against them. It's that simple. So for this morning, I thank you for your kind and patient attention. And let's stand